All right, well, our first game of the week we're going to jump into is Sydney FC 2, Central Coast Mariners nil. Now, Christian, I think it is time we have a bit of a serious chat about Sydney FC. I thought we were going to have this conversation a couple of weeks ago when they played the Knicks. They coughed up a lead in that game, so we're having it now instead after their win over the other top two side in the Mariners. That makes just 2 losses in their last 14 games. That run includes home and away outings to the Mariners and Wellington. It brings Talay's record to 10-4-5 since he took over after 3 rounds. Their top 2 numbers we're kind of talking about. And, you know, Christian, as we know in the A-League, it's not about how you start, it's about how you finish. And the Sky Blues are certainly finishing the season strong.
Yeah, exactly. And from memory, I don't have the record in front of me, but at home, Sydney an absolute beast this season, and in seasons past as well. They're so tough to beat over there. During large portions of this game, it was just all Sydney really just dominating from defence to attack. Mariners couldn't really get into the game. They were sort of more retracting back, putting numbers behind the ball. And, just from a Mariners perspective for a second, if you're going to go out with the intent of, sitting deep and keeping numbers back, like I said, then you're going to have to accept the consequences that come with it. One of those being that it's going to be incredibly difficult to transition into attack and, make up all that territory ahead, if you're going to have numbers back, which is why they desperately struggled to create anything meaningful. I mean, I think it was 3 shots for the whole game compared to Sydney's 27. So, yeah, it was all Sydney from start to finish and fully deserved the 3 points. And, yeah, you're right. We definitely have to start taking Sydney a bit more seriously because since Corica left and Talay took the reins, I think there's definitely a bit more blueprint, especially with their press, which I'm sure Jacob will touch on shortly. I think their pressure around the ball, winning back the ball within 4 to 6 seconds, that's really improved since Corica's left, and you can just see that real intensity, really pick up from the whole squad. So yeah, they're going to be a force to be reckoned with come finals.
Yeah, you're right. When the Mariners choose to set up that way, and we saw them do it really successfully against the Victory about a month or so ago now, you do have to accept the consequences of what comes of it. And look, I reflect on this game very similar to the Wellington game. Jesus Christ, okay. To the Wellington game a little while ago. And that was the last time I remember the Mariners being stifled in such a similar way. And Jacob, I'm interested in your perspective on this because I felt in that game against the Phoenix, Italiano chose to defend very narrow in setup off the ball, and that really condensed the midfield. And Talay was able to achieve the same result by doing it a different way. And obviously the high pressing game further up the field, the midfield line, the defensive line were higher up, and they were the ones condensing the midfield. 2 ways to go about it, but they achieved a very similar goal in the end.
Yeah, and I think it's because if you can condense the midfield against the Mariners, you're really taking their playmakers and their key players out of the game as much as possible. So, like you mentioned, it doesn't matter really how you do it, as long as it's done. That's going to be your best bet in trying to sort of stifle them and keep them out the game. I'll touch on what Sydney did here. Obviously, we've spoken about their press a few times before now. But even here, I think it was a little bit more conservative, perhaps, this game than we've seen in the past from them. They weren't pressing with entirely reckless abandon. It was much more poised and considered when they were doing it. I noticed a lot of the time that they would often wait for the Mariners players to turn their back on goal before they pressed them, and that way it forced the Mariners to play back towards their own goalkeeper rather than forwards. And I've spoken in the past about how that's when this Sydney team is really dangerous, is when you're not carrying your momentum forwards and you're not trying to get past their press and you're just sort of inviting it. And so, yeah, the Sydney players clearly well drilled, and Talay and Drilic have done a fantastic job with that. But I'm really excited by this idea of teams now sort of in the A-League starting to find their tactical identities a little bit. We've, been in the past all this discussion about how the A-League isn't tactically up to par with other leagues around the world, and we're really sort of starting to see it come into its own now, and we're seeing teams develop these little nuances and these things about their game that make things exciting, and teams are identifiable by how they play on the pitch more than just, their logo or their kit or their players or anything like that. And I sort of want to pose this question of, do we think that this high-pressing, high-intensity game, do we reckon that other teams around the league are going to potentially look to adopt this thing, seeing how successful Sydney have been with it?
It's an interesting question because I think a lot of that comes down to the coaches, obviously, and who's driving these different identities. A lot has been made of David Zrilic, who's the assistant at Sydney FC, and his influence under the Leipzig, school of football and implementing that system in Sydney FC. Obviously, you got to, there has to be certain people to implement in the right way. And to answer your question, I think no. I don't think the pressing game is outright going to be the way teams go. But I do agree with you in the fact that we are leaning towards this A-League where teams do have some very clear tactical identities. And we see them with Sydney FC and Wellington Phoenix are probably the two prime examples. Mark Jackson, we've talked about his ability as a tactician, but maybe not such a clear, distinct method of play. He can switch things around a bit. One thing I want to ask you as well quickly. Whoa.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say on that, I do agree with you, Lockie, but I agree for different reasons. I think part of the reason that the high press won't take over the A-League as sort of like a mainstream tactic is simply because it's very hard to keep up for 90 minutes. And when you look at what happens with the temperatures in summer, it saps your energy incredibly quickly. And so unless you're a team like a Wellington who generally play in cooler conditions because of the climate in Wellington, or maybe perhaps Auckland next season, taking advantage of that climate, it's very hard to do over the summer months. And so it's more maybe 3 weeks over, like at the start of the season, and then if you get the advantage of cooler temperatures over summer, maybe some later kickoffs or something like that, you could take advantage of it. But otherwise, I just think the heat would be a little bit too harsh for it to work all season long.
That's a good point as well. Jacob, on Josh Nisbet in this game, he didn't quite get into it in the way he usually does. I was just wondering, we've seen him in a couple of different roles this year. He's played in a 2 at the base of midfield. In this game, like he's been doing recently, especially out of position, he's been in the front 2 of this 4-4-2 for the Mariners. And I just wonder, these transition moments where Sydney are pressing so hard, Josh Nisbet's just often so far away from the ball, and it's really hard to get it to him. And he's their most dangerous player. You want to do that as much as possible, right?
Yeah, well, and this is the double-edged sword that comes with having someone like Mark Jackson as your coach, in that he's incredibly flexible in what he likes to do, and he can change things up in a moment's notice, and not all of those changes are going to work, and I think this is one where, given the situation, it didn't really work because you've taken your best player out of the spot where he really needs to be in this game, because Sydney are absolutely suffocating the middle of the park. And if you can have somebody who can, sort of dance his way through it, or maybe draw a foul here or there, and just sort of let things settle down or create something in those situations, then, that's going to potentially change the tides for you. But when you just stick to the status quo and you let Sydney press you out of the game, and you don't bring that player deeper to get him the ball earlier and let him try and do something, then you're really going to struggle. And it's a blessing and a curse, because you've got a coach and a player in Nisbet who are very, very versatile. But like I said, it's not going to work every single time when you try something new. And I think, he just looked a little bit lonely up top in this game. And again, that's because that midfield just couldn't get the ball to him. So I think it's one of those ones where you need that mid-game adjustment, and you need to sort of realise, okay, this isn't working. What can we do to remedy that? How can we get, our key playmaker involved in the game? And that's something that, oddly enough, Mark Jackson didn't do this game. We've seen him make a ton of mid-game adjustments all throughout the season, and this one, he just he seemed stumped with it. So it's a bit of a shame, because Nisbet's been in incredible form recently, and for him to have a game where he didn't really get involved at all, it's sort of a bit disappointing, I think, for him, for the Mariners, and definitely for their fans.
Another player who's been in a great run of form recently is Joe Lolly for the Sky Blues. He's almost kind of gone under the radar because I'd argue, probably just been consistently good just the whole year. And Christian, he had a moment of individual brilliance in this game down the wing to beat a couple of Mariners players, then the pass into Caceres, who finished for the opening goal. Lolly hasn't got on the score sheet, I think it's since January, but continues to contribute in many other ways. He's been crucial for Sydney FC as one of these visa players for a long period of time now, and he's going to be essential as they go into finals football.
Yeah, I think there was sort of a small period where there was a couple of games where he had a couple of poor games under Corica, and then we were sort of questioning whether is this the real Lolly? Are we going to see the best of him again? Because obviously the past couple of seasons we've seen that the quality that he has produced here in Australia, and yeah, under Tale, he's been excellent so far, and he demonstrated that again against the Mariners. Like you said, quality. He could beat a couple of players. Got that creativity. He's got the IQ. Obviously got the talent. To play in this league. So, I mean, yeah, especially in the finals when it comes around, he's going to be very important. Especially in that final third, where I think without him, I think they lack just that bit of creativity and spark to, ignite, some real clear-cut chances to create in front of goal for, the likes of their strikers to put away. Otherwise, without him, without his presence, I think, yeah, they're going to really, struggle to find those opportunities and create them.
And he sure left Storm Roo with something to remember him by as well, didn't he? The little elbow on the face. There was blood everywhere coming out the top of his eyebrow there. But Paletti as well, Joel King gets his first A-League goal in 88 A-League attempts, I'm pretty sure. But how unlucky for Brian Kaltak as well in this piece. A brilliant tackle to take it away from some other Sydney player who would have had a chance on goal. Then Joel King's first effort that he thought probably would have been good enough was cleared off the line by Brian Kaltak, but the second attempt from King got through. Great finish for him and great to get his goal, but how unlucky must Kaltak feel?
Kaltak would feel super gutted putting in all that effort and still seeing it go over the goal line. Anyway, if I'm remembering correctly as well, it's not just Joel King's first in the competition, but that was also Sydney's 1,000th goal on the men's side. So...
Right.
I believe that's all competitions, not just the league. I'll double check before we disconnect the call here as we record to double check on that. But yeah, so a milestone goal in multiple respects for Sydney FC and Joel King